Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Rubio, a professor of philosophy at Hope College. He's actually been on the channel before to discuss the ontological argument, though in that video, he was offering a critique of somebody who was criticizing the ontological argument. Now we've kind of turned the tables. This time, he's going to be giving his thoughts on the ontological argument that Dr. William Lane Craig defends in a short animated video. So the plan is we're going to play the video and let him comment on the clips that we play. Are you ready, Dr. Rubio?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
All right, here we go.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound.
Okay, so in the next part of the video, they'll actually present the argument, but before we do that, did you want to comment on any of this kind of introductory stuff?
Yeah, so I'll say they've already made a significant misstep here.
And what is that?
Anselm gave somewhere between 2 and 4 arguments in his original proslogion. That's the work of his that first introduced what we're calling ontological arguments. Then there was a critique of the proslogion by a monk named Gaunalo, and then it was a compelling enough critique that Anselm decided to go ahead and write a reply to Gaunalo. And there are scholarly debates about exactly how many different arguments he offers over the course of this exchange. What's definitely true is that the argument that this video talks about, what's come to be known as the modal ontological argument, is not the argument of Proslogion 2, the one that Anselm first offered. Now, arguably, there is something like this in the reply to Gaunalo, but the argument of Proslogion 2, and it kind of makes sense because the argument we're about to see isn't very metaphysical. The argument of Proslogion 2 is very metaphysical and turns on a theory about how metaphysics and cognition interact that ends up relying on something that looks a lot like Meinongianism. Whereas this argument just relies on some stuff in modal logic and some possibility claims, which again, Anselm may have offered something like this in the reply to Gaunalo. I'll just quickly shout out Robert Adams's paper, The Logical Structure of Anselm's Argument. It's still one of the best things that's ever been written on this topics, and it's been around for decades now. That being said, the modal ontological argument is a really interesting argument for the existence of God. It's just a different one from the one that we found in the Proslogion.
Okay, so the argument they're about to present, this you may find maybe elements of it in Anselm's reply to Gaunalo, but this version of the argument, is it fair to say that this version is Alvin Plantinga's version?
Yes, what they're giving us is Alvin Plantinga's version. Now, arguably, both Hartshorne and Malcolm had modal ontological arguments before. Of the philosophers we've mentioned, like Alvin Plantinga is the only one whose career overlaps significantly with a developed modern modal logic. So it makes sense that he's the first one who really laid this out precisely. Maybe it's between him and Adams who was first. I don't actually remember if Nature of Necessity or the logical structure of Ansels's argument was written first. But yeah, the presentation we're getting is effectively planning his argument, although it's maybe subtly different in important ways at the end.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get into this argument then.
Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
Let's pause there for a minute.
Possible world.
I just want to interject really quickly with here that these three traits, power, knowledge, and goodness, aren't actually going to do any work for us. And that the claim that in order to be God, you have to have them in every possible world is contentious. So like poor Richard Swinburne doesn't believe this, and people misclassify him all the time when they say that this is like the definition of God.
I see. Yeah, Richard Swinburne, if I understand correctly, he wants to say that it's possible that God doesn't exist, in which
Correct.
case he would be committed to saying there's a possible world. He may not be committed to saying there actually exist things like possible worlds, but we can use that language.
Yeah.
There's a possible world where God doesn't exist. Swinburne would say, yeah, that's right. But
right.
He's a little bit what's the word?
Idiosyncratic.
This isn't a common view. This is maybe
Yes.
a little bit more of an idiosyncratic view.
This is a much, much older view because Swinburne thinks about modality like somebody who was trained in the 50s.
All right. So would you say among theists at least, it's pretty standard to think of God as existing in every possible world?
Yeah, I'd say that's the majority report.
Okay. All right. Can I keep going with the video?
Yeah.
All right.
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait. A maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument.
All right. So I thought the summary might be a good place to pause.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything about the argument thus far?
Yeah. So they give us one conception of a possible world, but it's confusing, and it's confusing in ways that obscure what I think is the real thing at issue in the ontological argument. So we're just going to do like a quick sweep through the history of how modality and modal logic developed. The term possible world comes from Leibniz, and he used it to describe ways God could create, sort of worlds modulo God. After Leibniz, it didn't really receive much attention until Saul Kripke comes along in the 60s and provides the model theory for modal logic. Now, modal logic is sort of the logic with your basic propositional logic or predicate logic extended to include modal ideas like possibility and necessity, and maybe even more actuality and things like that. Modal logic developed a bit backwards. in formal logic, there are two important families of notions, the semantic ideas and the syntactic ideas. Semantic notions have to do with truth and meaning. Syntactic notions have to do with symbols and their rule-governed manipulation. Modal logic in the 20th century weirdly developed a syntax that is the little symbols, hooks, boxes, diamonds, and etc., as well as proof systems. So those are rule-governed systems for manipulating that syntax in order to create proofs before it had a model theory in place. So there's an early 20th century philosopher named C.I. Lewis who created 5 proof systems for modal logic and named them S1 through S5. So if any of you have heard the term like S4 or S5 out there, that's referring to some of the systems that C.I. Lewis developed. And for a long time, like that's what we had for modal logic. We had the syntax somewhat developed, but very little on the semantic end. The big achievement of Kripke's, and he did this while he was quite young, by the way, he comes along and gives a semantics for modal logic that just kind of fit beautifully and turned out to be wonderfully productive. What we learned is that 3 of the C.I. Lewis systems didn't really correspond to anything interesting, but the last 2 systems, 4 and 5, or what we now just know as S4 and S5, did. So Kripke's semantics work by assigning basic sentences. For those of you with a little familiarity with logic, those will be your propositions, your atomic sentences. Truth values relative to a background set of possible worlds. But Kripke's possible worlds aren't really the same as Leibniz's at all. They're just mathematical widgets in a theory of meaning. In fact, a lot of logicians will refer to them as points to make the distinction. Kripke then gave the modal operators, that is the box and diamond, their meaning by putting a relation called the accessibility relation on the background set of worlds. So to give the model theory of contemporary modal logic, you start with a set of points, and these could be dots, these could be numbers. By convention, they're called possible worlds. Then you have a relation over them, and this relation is roughly supposed to tell you which worlds are possible relative to each other. So roughly, taking x and y as possible worlds, if r, x, y, then y is possible relative to x, or from the perspective of x. Changing the properties of this relation yields what we call frames, and these frames induce different modal logics. 2 of the frames turned out to induce Lewis's S4 and S5. S4 is when the accessibility relation is transitive and reflexive. S5 is when it's an equivalence class, so add in symmetry. There turned out to be a bunch of other interesting frames that have logics that C.I. Lewis never thought of. And the work of modal logicians since Kripke has in part involved mapping out what logics which frames get you, and which frames don't get you logics, because some of them don't. This is important for the ontological argument for 2 reasons. Number 1, Kripke's definition, or Kripke's idea, is the precise notion of possible world required to make the underlying logic of the argument work. Number 2, the modal ontological argument is not valid in every frame. There are, of the 6 most studied frames, 2 of them in which it's valid. One known as System B, that's a symmetric and reflexive accessibility relation, and S5. Now, the good news for this argument is that those are both pretty popular frames. A lot of people think if you're doing the logic of metaphysical modality, it probably has at least the properties of System B. But it's worth pointing out that there are a bunch of other systems of modal logic in which this isn't a valid argument, which, whether the argument's valid depends on what your background modal logic is. And your background modal logic is a substantial assumption. It's something that requires philosophical argumentation to establish. It's not just a given. By contrast, the idea of a possible world as a maximal way the world could be comes from metaphysics. Kripke's logical discoveries were really exciting and inspired some of the best metaphysicians of the 20th century to think very carefully about the nature of modality. The metaphysician's possible world is a theoretical widget to account for or represent, sort of depending on what approach you're taking, modality as a feature of the world, not as a mathematical widget in the model theory of a system of logic. There's a connection to Kripke's work, since Kripke's possible worlds help give meaning to the symbols that make modal logic distinctively modal, but they don't follow the same rules. Now, maybe there's like some kind of dream of harmony where you could have a Kripke model where all the points just are the metaphysician's possible worlds, but for technical reasons, this is probably not achievable. What's important here is that the possible worlds that make modal logic, and therefore the modical ontological argument tick, are the logician's points, not the metaphysician's ways. It would probably be better to leave the argument couched in the language of possibility and necessity, and only bring in the idea of a possible world when explaining how the logic that makes it go works, which unfortunately the video didn't do.
Okay, that was good. There was several things there that I didn't really know about the development of modal logic, so I'm glad you gave some background.
Yeah, it's a fun history.
So one thing you said was the argument might be better to just couch it in terms of possibility. So if I put it back up on the screen, you wouldn't mess with premise 1 because that's only talking about possibility, right?
Right.
But premise 2 brings in the notion of a possible world. And so you're thinking at that point, well, I'm curious. Okay, so I see 6 steps in this argument. If we couch it in terms of possibility, what about the argument would change?
Here's how I would explain this modal ontological argument. Premise 1, the possibility premise, possibly God exists. Premise 2, the theological premise. If possibly God exists, then possibly necessarily God exists. That specifically, would you defend that by saying, well, look, if God exists, God has to exist necessarily because of something about maximal greatness or aseity. There are a couple of ways to argue for this. Once you're there, once you have possibly necessarily God exists, the modal logic will take you the rest of the way to God exists. You just have to do the appropriate substitutions, instances, in axioms of either S5 or B. That reveals 2 things. Number 1, it reveals how much work the choice of modal system is doing, since it's taking you from possibly necessarily God exists to God exists. Number 2, it reveals the 2 key assumptions you've got to defend: the possibility of God existing and the theological account of God that makes God into a necessary being. And notice there, you don't have to say anything about possible worlds. You honestly don't have to bring in the idea of maximal greatness. Now, that's something that comes in a couple of steps down the line in some of these arguments, either as a defense of the theological premise or as a response to certain kinds of parody argument that come up later in the video.
Okay.
But the key idea is just possibly there's a God. Here's some theology that says if there's a God, there's got to be that God's got to be necessary, and then modal logic, a modal system that does its work.
Okay. So yeah, if you were revising this argument, basically steps 2 through 6 would change. Well, actually, step 1 would change too. It's just, you don't need to talk about a maximally great being. You don't need to talk about possible worlds or actual worlds. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, you would pretty significantly revise this argument as it stands.
Yeah, I think the right way to phrase the modal ontological argument is both simpler and different, and emphasizes different things than the way they laid it out.
Okay. Let me keep playing the video.
Before you do that, I have a second round of comments on the,
the argument. Go for it.
This one on the way they use the idea of coherence to defend what I would call the possibility premise.
Okay.
So the connection between logical coherence and existing in a possible world, which is the sort of notion that they use when they're trying to defend the possibility of God existing, is a good case in point for keeping the metaphysical and semantic devices separate. As critics of this argument, or metaphysicians arguing for metaphysical theses in general have observed, it's pretty normal for incompatible theses or things to both be logically coherent, even when those things or theses purport to be necessary truths or necessary existence. We can see this uncontroversially in mathematics. So take the continuum hypothesis. There's nothing incoherent about the continuum hypothesis. So by the logic of the video, the continuum hypothesis is true at some possible world. Now take the negation of the continuum hypothesis. There's also nothing incoherent about the negation of the continuum hypothesis. The fact that the continuum hypothesis is independent of the standard axioms of mathematics is proof of both coherence claims. So by the logic of the video, the negation of the continuum hypothesis is true in some possible world. But mathematical truths are only true if they are necessarily true. So by the logic of the video, both the continuum hypothesis and its negation are true. And of course, that can't be. That's a contradiction. Where did we go wrong? Well, if you want to talk about the logician's possible worlds, it's relatively harmless to say that any coherent thesis is true of one of them. You'll just have to draw up your model so that the worlds at which necessarily incompatible theses are true can't access, that is to say, aren't possible relative to each other. But the metaphysician's worlds are more demanding. You've got to choose one or the other to be possible. Since both are coherent, mere coherence isn't good enough.
All right. Are you okay to keep playing the video?
Yeah, we can proceed now.
All right.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a god is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor or a square circle or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea.
Okay, so let me pause it there. Yeah, what did you want to comment on this type of response to the ontological argument?
Yeah, so the pizza thing was cute. That's it's an homage to Guanalo's original response to Anselm, in which he talks about a maximally great island, which he composed as a parody to Anselm's original argument from Proslogion 2. But notably, and kind of circling back to the video's original sin, the Proslogion 2 argument is not the modal ontological argument. It's a different argument. So the Guanalo-style parody isn't even a response to the modal ontological argument. It's a response to the other argument that Anselm gives in the Proslogion. And like, if they recognized that there are at least two, possibly as many as 4 distinct arguments here, they might have chosen their objection to respond to better, because Guanalo-style parodies are not the biggest problem for modal ontological arguments. Here's the biggest problem for arguments like this. Just like the concept of God seems coherent, but like we'll hedge here for apophatic concerns, worries about the limits of human cognition, like those are all real difficulties, even in saying I think that our concept of God is coherent. Possibilities that exclude God also seem coherent. It seems perfectly coherent that there be nothing at all, or that there be an endless ocean full of pink shrimp. No God in either of these possibilities. But now the ontological argument can be thrown in reverse. If the nothing world, or the shrimp-only world, is genuinely possible, it looks like God is out of business. We have to choose which of our coherent possibilities to embrace and which to discard. And so far, no one has given a convincing reason to discard the one or the other. Plantinga, by the way, was well aware of this. In his recreation of the modal ontological argument, he's pretty honest that the theist does not have a silver bullet defense of the possibility premise, but he thought the possibility premise is at least reasonable to accept, thereby rendering theism at least reasonable, and that's not nothing.
Okay, so on this point, does the definition that the theist uses of God, what do I want to say here? So take your shrimp-only world.
Mm-hmm.
If the theist, just what they mean by God is like a necessarily existent person or being or something like that, then the theist is gonna think, well, there can't be a shrimp-only world.
Correct.
Right. But I guess in terms of, I'm thinking of it in terms of a kind of dialectic, like what's supposed to move the non-theist. This argument, if the argument ends up hinging, I guess, on just how you define God or something like that, then I don't know that it's going to be all that useful in moving a non-theist. So I don't really know what the argument.
Exactly. And this is the thing that nobody knows. Nobody knows how to get that possibility premise and prove that that's the possibility claim we should go in for, rather than like the nothing claim or the shrimp only claim. That's where the front line on this argument exists right now. You've got the theist who is, it seems to me, perfectly reasonable in asserting the existence or the possible existence of a God. But then the atheist who's perfectly reasonable in asserting any of these other God-free possibilities. And there's a stalemate. That's why I say there's no silver bullet. But there is maybe a vindication of the rationality of theism.
I don't know if I'll include this in the video or not. We'll see it. Just while I have you for a few minutes, I want to pick your brain on this point. So the only thing I can think of is if the theist said something like, well, God is well, I don't know if this will get back into the maximally great stuff, but if we want to say like, God is a perfect being. So what kind of properties might a perfect being have? Would it be a perfection to have necessity rather than contingency? If it seems to you that is a perfection, by that I'm talking about necessity. So if it's that necessity is a perfection, then God is a necessary being plugged into your first premise of the argument, like possibly God exists, so possibly a necessary being exists. I don't know. Is that enough to maybe like put some pressure on the non-theist to say, would the non-theist have to say, you know what, necessity isn't a perfection, and so you're gonna have to do something else in that first premise? I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah. So what you mentioned sounded more to me like a defense of what I call the theological premise. The premise that says if God exists, then God necessarily exists. And
yeah.
The atheist can accept that just fine. I think many atheists do. They'll just say, yeah, if we were fortunate enough to have a perfect being, or maybe atheists will not put the fortunate enough in there, then it would be a necessarily existent one. But look, here's the problem. We don't have a perfect being. And even though we can think of plenty of beings that would be perfect if they did exist, none of them do.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that definitely, what I said would fit as a defensive premise too.
Yeah.
And
Premise 2,
You
I tend
can't-
to think, is relatively easy to defend. It's premise 1 that's really difficult.
Yeah. And appealing to just the coherence. Like it's a coherent concept, or, I can conceive of it. I can conceive of God existing. These aren't going to work as a good defense of premise 1, because what you're saying is, well, I can conceive of Shrimp World or these other things. Okay.
Now, you could accept both worlds if you weakened your modal logic, but then the argument wouldn't be valid anymore. So it's like a series of trade-offs. The stronger you make your modal logic, the more you have to work for your possibility claim. The weaker you make your modal logic, the less you have to work for the possibility claim, but then at a certain point, you lose the argument's validity.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, what are you aware of, like, maybe one of the best current defenses of premise 1, since so much hinges on it?
There have been attempts. So Leibniz tried. Kant's pre-critical book, his One Possible Demonstration, kind of plays around with the idea. In the contemporary literature, I honestly haven't seen anything that I find very compelling.
Gotcha. All right.
I know Leibniz's attempt didn't work, but it's probably still the best one we've got in the history of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, let me put why don't we finish out the video, and then I think there's only like 20 seconds left, and
I've got a concluding spiel.
Okay, cool. Let me finish playing the video, and then you can conclude.
Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Okay.
All right, so final verdict. This is a complicated argument, and there's no doubt they oversimplified it. In oversimplifying it, they missed important distinctions between metaphysics and semantics and managed to obscure its most difficult problems. By the standards of analytic philosophy, that's a failure. Analytic philosophers aim for maximal clarity so that our claims are as easy as possible to refute. The last thing we want to do is shadow the weaknesses in our arguments with misdistinctions. This is how we aim at truth. Now, I'm not saying that they intentionally confuse the logicians and metaphysicians' ideas of possible worlds, or even intentionally did the wrong argument for mismatched the argument and the objection that they took. But philosophy is hard, and we miss things all the time. However, the end result is a very flawed account of this argument. But, it's not the worst presentation of the ontological argument that I've ever seen.
Okay, so final thoughts. I think I see where you're coming from. It sounds like there's probably no version of the ontological argument that you think is sound. Am I understanding you?
I actually do think this one is sound, but I'm pretty sure I can't prove the first premise.
Okay, that's interesting. You think it's sound, but you can't prove the first.
I believe that God's possible. I wouldn't be a theist if I weren't. And the rest of the argument, I think, is relatively straightforward. But I couldn't prove that to somebody who disagreed with me.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Well, I've had a lot of fun talking with you. And it sounds like
enjoyable.
You pointed people to the Robert Adams. Was it a paper or was it a book?
It's a paper.
A paper.
Now,
okay.
I will issue a level 3 technical alarm on that paper. It gets pretty involved, especially later in. But it really is just wonderfully clear and makes a lot of distinctions that sometimes get obscured in less technical work. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Daniel, for doing this. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was good chatting with you again.
All right. Thank you all for watching, and check out the playlist where I have theists on to help us think about the other videos that Dr. Craig produced in this animated series. Thanks for watching. See you next time.